So thank you again for being here. And we are going to start off tonight with Rey Zeemer. And I'm going to introduce Rey, as I will for all our authors tonight. Rey G Ziemer is a poet and fiction writer born and raised on the south side of Chicago. He now resides on the west branch of the DuPage River and teaches composition at College of DuPage. So Rey, we're looking forward to hearing from you. The time is yours.
Thanks very much. Thanks to Wheaton Public Library and to you and Courtney for inviting me to participate. So as mentioned, I'm Rey Zeemer, and being a city guy, I grew up on the south side of Chicago and married my high school girlfriend. And we lived in Oak Park for about 10 years, and then moved to DuPage County after I built a house in an unincorporated area on the outskirts of Wheaton. We raised our two boys there and enjoyed what was then almost a country atmosphere, a very rural and small town atmosphere. You know, we were surrounded by cornfields and enjoyed the Lincoln Marsh and Cosley Zoo, and rode our bikes to town on the Illinois Prairie Path. So that neighborhood became the setting of my novel, The Ghost of Jamie Mcveigh. So I was teaching junior high school at the time, language arts, and thought I'd like to write a book for young adults, something that both boys and girls would enjoy, something that would capture the drama of teenage lives. I was intrigued as we rode down the Prairie Path by its origins as a light railway line. So I told my kids the story of how the path came to be haunted by the ghost of an old-time railroad man killed in a train wreck there. So I'd like to read part of the first chapter of that book, when Brian, the teenage narrator, runs down the path one evening after a fight with his father, and there he has his first encounter with the ghost of Jamie Mcveigh. That's the cover. I get it right. The ghost of Jamie Mcveigh. The trail curved above a sea of cattails that rippled in the evening breeze. Right below the path spread an open patch of shallow water, brass-colored like the sky. I paused to look at the way the sun was setting behind the dark fringe of willows on the far shore. Mosquitoes whined, and I swatted one on my forehead. It was weird. No traffic, no houses, no people. Like another time far away from my troubles and all the commotion. Still, there was a sadness here, a distant memory, but somehow tangible. It got stronger as I stood there, swelling up like a lump in my throat, and a swirl of other feelings washed over me. Pictures and sounds out of nowhere. Too many thoughts cramming into my head all at the same time. Contorted faces, crackling flames, blasting heat, shrill screams, all twisting in and out of my mind, images in a mental kaleidoscope. I collapsed on a bench alongside the path and bent over, looking at my torn gym shoes, blood rushing in my ears. When I looked up, my head spun, and the landscape kind of shivered. I realized the ground was vibrating, barely noticeable at first, but building up like something big was coming up on me. I peered down the path both ways into the dark, but there was nothing to be seen. A low hum came on, like the drone of an airplane way in the distance, and I became aware of the smells, the rotten stink of black muck, a weedy midsummer sting in my nostrils. This had something else to it, hot grease or machinery burning or something I couldn't quite figure. It got so thick I could taste it, this heavy, oily smell around telephone poles. That vibrating hum ramped up, and I was sitting there trying to figure all this out when it hit. Wham! This blast of air came out of nowhere and practically flattened me, cold and hot at the same time, wet and dry all at once, speeding 100 miles an hour when it slammed me. I thought I was dead, the devil come to get me. I gripped the edge of the bench while it all washed over me. White explosions of light flashed in my eyes, and the sound was all around, metallic thunder and lightning, punctuated with an urgent jangling bell and rhythmic clicks and clacks, clickety-clack, clickety-clack. That was it, of course. I remembered standing at a railway station when an express train blasted through. This was just like that. Like I'd been standing a little too close to the edge of the platform when a big old train rumbled by, and its rush through the air whacked me enough to muss my hair. The sound diminished, dragged away in its wake, the bell clanging muted into the distance. My ears followed the clatter way up the slope and around the bend in the trail. My eyes tried to trace where the path disappeared in the gathering darkness and thickening mist. But of course, there was nothing. There never had been. It was just me sitting there with chills and goosebumps and my hair standing on end. I was losing my mind. I knew it. I shook my head like trying to get water out of my ears and rubbed my eyes. Everything was still. Was I hallucinating or? No. It was just a weird feeling had come over me. That was all. And a squall had blown up, a sudden gust of wind. Maybe I dozed off for a second and this goofy daydream slipped in because of seeing those railroad tracks earlier. I still had the shivers and the clammy feeling all over, so I jumped up and jogged a few steps in place, shaking my head again to get those bells out of my ears. It was dusky dark now, and a genuine fog building up. I couldn't see more than 25 feet in any direction, but glowing way down the path, magnified in the chill of the cloud, was that red light, wavering, swaying back and forth. At least I wasn't the only weirdo out still running around in the dark. I walked toward it expecting to catch sight of somebody on a bicycle at that red light, somebody carrying it in my direction. It never got any closer, though, twinkling and disappearing as the trail left the marsh behind and ducked back into its dark tunnel of trees. I turned and looked back up the path where swirling fog washed away the scene. Just as I was about to jog off again, I spotted that red gleam out in the middle of the nothing. Whoever it was must have left the path and struck out across the marsh, swinging his little dim red light like a signal to somebody unseen over on the other side. That's the Ghost of Jamie Mcveigh, Chapter 1. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ray. I am struck by how incredibly vivid the details are in that, and it's always so deeply pleasurable for me to know that a piece of writing is anchored, truly anchored in setting. So I'm really grateful to you. Because of the time, if you all have questions for Ray, I would just ask that you put them in the chat. I know I have some questions about ghost stories and the motivation to write this as a ghost story, but I will ask that when we all gather together at the end. Some of you did make some comment about the audio breaking up. I saw that, and it does happen at times, and it has to do with internet connection and all the variabilities of that. So just be patient, and like I was able to hear missed a few things, but I was able to hear how rich that passage was. So thank you again, Ray.
Thank you.
That. Our next reader is Nicole Duran. Nicole also works under other pseudonyms, Nicole Schuster and Nicole Hughes. She is 24, a recent graduate of Dominican University with an MLIS, and she's an avid reader who's known she wants to become an author since the 8th grade. The books she's published thus far are fairy tale and fantasy, but she has works in progress in various genres. So
Pretty much all of them.
great, thank you. I'm sure we'll have questions about that.
As she said, I'm Nikki, and the book I'm going to be sharing from is called The Savior, and it was published under Nicole Schuster. It was the first one I did. The book itself is about a post-apocalyptic Alice in Wonderland kind of deal, and the segment I'll be reading from is the trip or fall into Wonderland. For context, the main character is Ashley Lewis, and she's part of this resistance movement called Caterpillar, who've dedicated themselves to liberating Earth from the Queen of Hearts. In the chapter right before this, Ashley and other girls were selected as tributes or sacrifices in the snare and escorted through the rabbit hole by the Queen's card guards. And that's where we pick up. That's the cover. That's all I got. And here we go. For those of you who don't know, portal travel sucks. You're spinning uncontrollably, clinging onto the hand of the girl in front of you, unable to even scream. All you can see is a swirling mass of reds, and you're falling so fast they all blur together. It's dead silent. You can't hear anything, not even your own blood rushing in your ears. And after a second, you can't tell which way is up. Honestly, for all I know, I was falling sideways. I can't tell you how long we were falling, but I remember our landing. The minute the hole ended, the world turned blue. I'm talking the purest of sky blues that only exists in fairy tales. That's how I knew I was in Wonderland. The sky never gets that blue anymore, not on Earth. 3 seconds after I saw the sky, I landed on top of the girl who had grabbed my hand. It's amazing none of us broke anything crashing to the ground like that, but I rolled off her and was on my feet before I knew what was going on. I was dazed and confused and prepared myself as if I was about to run or fight for my life. Both seemed applicable. The ace of spades was about 5 feet away from me at the very edge of a dirt circle we had landed in. I looked around, trying to catch my breath and take in my surroundings. The hole had dumped us in the center of a dirt circle the same size as the pavilion, and round every edge of the circle, with the exception of a path that led forwards, there was a forest, only it looked strange. Maybe I'd gotten too used to the pictures of woods? It's not like there were groves of trees in Darkwell. It was all hills and destruction, and I'd spent most of my time underground anyway. Ladies, welcome to Wonderland, a gravelly male voice called from the mouth of the path. I spun around and almost screamed. The thing standing in the only exit was grotesque. He, I suppose, was stick thin, to the point where I could see his ribs through the button-down shirt he wore, and about a foot taller than the card guards. His bald head was covered in scars, as if someone had taken a dull knife and tried to peel his scalp off. His eyes were pure white, no color or pupils at all, and yet it appeared as though he could see perfectly. His pants were barely secured to his bony hips, and he clasped his skeletal hands in front of his chest, the expression on his face almost pleasant, welcoming. His skin was so thin it looked almost translucent and vaguely blue. He looked like a skeleton held together by his skin alone. He seemed to notice that I was staring at him, because his skull spun towards me with such speed I was afraid it was going to fall off. The moment his eyes made contact with mine, I fell to the ground screaming. It was like every vein in my body was filled with gasoline, and his gaze was a lit match. I was positive that I was burning from the inside out. I don't know how long it took, but the pain eventually stopped. I crouched there, gasping, before I had the strength to look up. The man was different now. He was less skeletal. He seemed to have filled out, for his shirt wasn't hanging on him any longer, and his hands looked larger. His skin was parchment colored now, as opposed to being translucent, and he seemed more alive than before, even if he still looked a step above death warmed over. And that's where I'll stop.
Awesome. Let me check. I'm not sure if there were any questions. Feel free to bring them to our attention. But I have to say, Nikki, it was so incredible to be transported into that other world. And I love the resonance and connection of Alice in Wonderland. Do you often kind of take as launch pads previous fairy tales or narratives or fables, things like that?
One of the things I'm actually working on is a collection of short stories, like twisted fairy tales, based off of all the original ones. As for that one, I just kind of thought of the phrase post-apocalyptic Alice in Wonderland and went from there, just because I had never really heard of that thing at the time.
Huh, interesting. And how much did you draw from, like, structured around the original plot?
I tried to keep most of that, like at least recognize the distinct landmarks of Wonderland, and I looked at as many different variations of the original as I could just to see. But I think mostly I drew from the Disney movie and the original book.
Cool. Well, like Ray's, I mean, it's so fun to have this kind of reference point for reality, but then just to feel like it kind of cracks open and becomes something new. That the world has many more layers than we assume, I think. I'm curious if there are any other questions. We still have a little of time left to ask Nikki a few. I guess I would ask, what has your publishing process been?
I self-published. So,
Awesome. Did you use a particular platform?
Okay, it started as Create Space, but that it basically was bought out by Amazon Direct Publishing. So I basically just transferred it over.
Great. Are you, I don't know if anybody else out there is self-publishing, but it's a perfect time to kind of mention something that's affiliated with the library that's called inky.org. I don't know if you're aware of that, Nikki, or had any experience with it, but
I have not heard.
You can, as a self-published author, you can upload your materials, upload them, your materials, make them available to libraries through inky.org. And so it's a kind of app, like our audio apps or ebook apps like Overdrive or Libby or RB Digital. And that way people can connect with your work through a library platform. And there are even author prizes affiliated with inky.org, where the manuscripts, the books, are evaluated by librarians. So I might, in the email that I'll send this to you, Courtney, I can send you some information on inky.org, and then maybe that could be incorporated into the email that you send out at the end, along with the evaluation, and also the places where you can buy our authors' books, links to those sites. So it's kind of exciting. I don't know if this is another question. Here's a question. Let me see. Well, this is a wonderful question for Ray, but I think we're going to save that for the end. And then we will read through the questions and allow people to ask questions of either the author who's presenting now or of everyone at the end. Okay, and that's my timer. So we have our next reader. Thank you, Nikki, so much for sharing your work. We have our next reader, and it's Juan David. I hope I don't mispronounce your name. It's Juan David Campolargo.
Perfect. You said it right.
Terrific. Thank you for being with us, Juan David. I will read now his bio just to give a little introduction. Juan David states that his mission in life is to help people, which to him means creating companies, writing books, giving TEDx talks, inventing products, and doing things society can't and won't do. I imagine the list is long, actually, when I think about that. So Juan David, we're so glad you're with us and eager to hear about your work and maybe a little bit from your work as well.
Definitely. First of all, thank you so much for the opportunity, and hopefully I can keep up with the other authors, because the first and the second one were really good, and I'm really impressed by the quality of the work. So I will be reading from my book called Generation Optimism, and to give you a little backstory of why and why I wrote the book. So my generation, which is Gen Z, people who are in high school like me, those are Gen Z. And after reading some research papers and surveys, I've realized and saw that my generation is one of the most pessimistic generations in the history of humankind. So for me, I wanted to write this book as a way to inspire my peers and the world as a whole to embrace this new perspective. And the excerpt that I'm going to be reading today is hopefully one that you guys like, and was actually picked up by Arianna Huffington, she's the owner of the Huffington Post. All right, here we go. Why optimism isn't about positivity. In the book Darwin's Pharmacy, author Rich Doyle talks about finding ways to become aware of the feedback loops among our creative, linguistic consciousness, experience choices. In other words, our capacity that we have to mold our life. A lot of people go through life thinking that they have no control over what happens. Their life just happens to them. And that's not true. We have a lot more control than we think. And this control that I'm talking about comes from the power of feedback loops. You can decide how your day is going to go by meeting with a friend, going to your favorite restaurant, listening to your favorite music, and drinking a certain beverage. Again, you can decide to be optimistic and look for the best possible experience. Once you recognize the power of feedback loops, you can create the intention of being optimistic. Self-awareness in our life brings us, as gimmicky as it might sound, life-changing benefits. The free will that we possess to decide and execute the ideas and experiences that we want to have is a source of true happiness and therefore optimism. Psychologist and author Martin Seligman says, the key to optimism lies in our explanatory styles, how we describe our life events to ourselves. Seligman believed that anyone can learn optimism. As I said, by simply asking themselves more questions before automatically defaulting into a negative response. I couldn't agree more with Seligman, but the amount of effort this takes is huge. We are just used to falling into a negative reaction. We do it all the time. Pessimism is for lazy people. It's our default reaction, while optimism takes effort and commitment. Dreams plus reality plus determination plus optimism equals success. A little while ago, I read a book by Ray Dalio called Principles. In this New York Times bestseller, Dalio shares the story of his life and how he came up with his principles that are, as he says, the main cause of his success. I enjoy every word of this book, mostly because he's the founder of Bridgewater Associates, which is the largest hedge fund in the world. I love investing in the stock market, so reading how he started, his journey, and how he's funded his company was really thought-provoking and very interesting. So one of the topics that resonated with me the most was one of his life principles. And he says, dreams plus reality plus determination equals a successful life. Dalio writes that his formula is almost always true, but he forgot a variable, which is optimism. If you want your formula to work, not always, but always, optimism can be left out. If you're a dreamer, you're realistic and you're determined, and most importantly, you're optimistic, success will be just a result of your actions. Importantly, optimism is not about being positive as much as it is about being determined and enthusiastic. Susan Segerstrom, in her book Breaking Murphy's Law, outlines what she and other researchers have found. Rather than giving up and walking away from difficult situations, optimists attack problems head on. They plan a course of action, seek out advice from others, and stay focused on solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Incredibly inspiring. And I think for me, I'll just say this, and it's really interesting to hear given our context and all that's going on in the United States and in the world right now. Thank you. We do have a question from the audience, and Catherine asks, Juan David, how old were you when you began writing?
Definitely. I started writing when I was, the book. I started writing the book when I was 16. I'm currently 17, so 16.
And you're how old now?
I'm 17.
Okay, wow. Okay. How do you start are you in school?
I actually just graduated from high school. Even though I should be a junior, like senior next year, but I guess I'm a year ahead.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm 17.
I'm super curious how you, I think one of the challenges of writing is just sticking with it and being disciplined and carving out the time and showing up even when the words aren't there, And I'm very curious how you managed to do that. Well, I'm assuming you were at least partly in school when you were working on it.
Full time, yeah, of course.
Yeah. So how did you do that?
Well, one thing is that I never thought I would write a book. That was never something that I thought or was in my radar. But one of the things that I really believe in is that if you can do something to help others or to inspire others, why not? I have never written a book. I actually moved from Venezuela a few years ago, so writing a book in English it's something that is a little something, right? And for me, it was, if writing a book is hard, for me, that English wasn't my first language. It was a little harder, right? But I'm not a writer, I'm not an author. I see myself as a person who sees opportunities, and if I can do something to help others, why not? And this time was a book, and I went for it.
That's awesome. Did you ever find yourself writing certain passage in your original language just to have some more facility, just to kind of shape it and then translate?
Not really. I think both languages were pretty different, and something that I actually wrote an essay recently that is on my website is that I've come to realize that in different languages, I think differently and I see the world differently. And in Spanish, which is my native language, my native language, I just think differently. And in English, I just think in a total different way. So it wouldn't have helped me as much to write in Spanish. But that's a good idea. I didn't consider it.
That's really interesting. Makes me wonder about how just speaking in English forms my thoughts. So thank you for that. Thank you for sharing with us tonight. And
thank you.
Our next reader, our fourth reader, and presenter will be Eva Bacon. Eva holds a BA from Stanford and a PhD in history from the University of Chicago. She recently retired from Lewis University after a 25-year teaching career concentrating on Eastern European history, intellectual history, and more recently on the history of genocide and Holocaust. Her book, Saving Lives in Auschwitz, was chosen in 2019 as the first-year reader for 600 Lewis students. And since research reveals that despite a mandate to teach the Holocaust, only 30% of high school graduates are able to identify Auschwitz correctly. Thank you so much for being with us, Eva. We look forward to hearing from you.
Hi, Karen. Thanks very much to the library for organizing this. Nonfiction writers work under different parameters. There's not that creativity. There's not the kind of imagination that is involved. What I deal with is evidence-based. I deal with a tremendous amount of research. I look for source materials. And then eventually I have to pull it together in terms of interpretation and analysis. As an academic writer, I do not, for instance, work with an agent. I've heard many tales that finding an agent is important. My press is Purdue University, which specializes in the kinds of work that I do. So some of the agony of publication is different kind of an agony. It's still agonizing, but it is in a more sort of a controlled way. The name of my book is essentially an oxymoron. What I'm writing about is how to save lives in Auschwitz, because on the whole, when Auschwitz is spoken about, certainly in the Western community, it concentrates on death, not on saving lives. My subject has not been well explored. It is a hospital which was organized by and staffed by prisoners within one of the Auschwitz units. So it's essentially counterintuitive that such a thing should exist. So I wanted to find out how they were able to manage to organize a hospital, what the impact was on the prisoners whom they served, and who were the men who worked in the hospital itself. By and large, my subject is not the root and branch murder of Jews coming into Auschwitz. Those arrived and were usually selected for extermination within a day. However, amongst the hundreds of thousands of people who came in, what the Nazis withdrew from it were young people who could work, mostly men, some women. So in point of fact, as I tried to figure out who were these workers in Auschwitz, the point here was to understand what does it mean to be in a labor camp. We've all seen Arbeit macht frei above the gates of Auschwitz. Well, that was because the illusion was that this is simply a labor camp. It's not until 1942 that it became the extermination camp. The other thing too that became clear as I was working on it, that Auschwitz, which we think of as a unit, is actually 46 separate camps. Some, the oldest one, Auschwitz I, the one that was used for the extermination process after the final solution was announced, was Auschwitz II, Birkenau in Brzeźnia. But my work is with Auschwitz III, which is then the unit that was created in order to support a factory. So the factory shows some of the sort of cynical and exploitative relationship between the state and big business, because the state, the Nazi state, promised a supply of inexhaustible cheap labor and factories for ammunition, factories for production of uniforms, mines, various kinds of farm units, and also a gigantic chemical factory, then moved to Auschwitz in order to exploit this particular labor pool. So the people who were in the labor pool were from all over Europe. As the war went on, heavily Jewish, but in 1939, 1940, and 41, since Auschwitz was located not far from Krakow, it was used to decapitate civil society in Poland. So this would mean then journalists, teachers, lawyers, artists, actors were being pulled out of society in order to essentially get rid of leadership in society. And they ended up within the confines of Auschwitz, Gentile and Jew both. So this Auschwitz III was built to hold 10,000 slave laborers, to build then this gigantic chemical factory for IG Farbenindustrie. One of the covers that my book has an image of the factory on it, and Purdue University pulled it because the first reaction to this image was that this had something to do with extermination, with the crematoria. But in point of fact, this is a chemical factory built close to 15 kilometers away from Auschwitz II, which was the extermination site. So we have here then this problem that the factory thought that they could use the brute labor very rapidly and quickly, but the brute labor was not fed, was subject to diseases, was subject to accidents within this large factory, and a infirmary had been set up in Auschwitz III, Bunamonowitz, to take care of these sort of quotidian difficulties. And in 1942, there was a crisis in all of the camps around Auschwitz, and that was typhus. And typhus was so severe, it not only killed prisoners who were in very bad physical shape anyway, but it started killing the SS as well. And the SS brought in a physician to control the epidemic. So sounds kind of familiar, right? Controlling. And in the process, the SS decided that they were going to permit the expansion of that little two-barrack unit of infirmary in Auschwitz III into something that worked better. And their first thing was that they were now going to employ actual physicians, prisoner physicians, who were then what are called functionary prisoners. So within the 2.5 years that this hospital existed, over 41 physicians worked in this Krankenhaus, in this hospital for prisoners. All of them were prisoners themselves from all over Europe, from Hungary, Czechoslovakia, from France, from Switzerland, from Poland as well. And as it happens, my father had just graduated from the university in Krakow with a degree of an MD, and he then became a functionary prisoner within this unit. And then the evidence base that I'm using is the oral testimony he gave to the museum in Auschwitz in 1972 as to what actually was going on, how it was organized, and what was happening within the hospital. So I have a source written in Polish. I needed to translate it into English, and then I discovered I needed to create a context so my children could read this. This was their grandfather. And in the process, it became then a historical work as opposed to a memoir or a biography. And I had to look for corroboration. Was there anyone else who could talk about what was happening here? This is a unexplored area. There is really no literature per se of prisoners organizing themselves in this fashion, but I was able to find then patients. And the one that is going to be most familiar to Americans is Elie Wiesel. Elie Wiesel and his father had been arrested in Romania, Hungary in 1944, and they were brought into Auschwitz, and their work unit became Auschwitz III. Elie Wiesel himself injured a foot, injured a foot, became infected, and he was in the hospital. So in Night, Elie Wiesel talks about his experiences within this unit. The line which stays with me is that he says he'd forgotten what it felt like to have clean sheets. Another very, very prominent man who was in the hospital was Primo Levi, who is perhaps the most distinguished writer about the experience in Auschwitz. He had much more serious problems, and he then also, again, not knowing the physicians themselves, talks about what it meant to have this hospital and what kind of care they could get there. His compatriot was Dr. Bruno De Benedetti, and Dr. Benedetti wrote an article in Italian in 1946, as soon as he got out of Auschwitz, in order to talk about, from a physician's point of view, what were the kind of capacities that the hospital had. They had special wards for infectious diseases, they had wards for tuberculosis, they had surgical wards, they had washing facilities, laundry facilities, heating facilities. We're short of a lot of stuff, but those were there. So this is 3 sources. Then the Polish physician Czesław Jaworski, who survived this entire experience, even though he was easily 20 years older than any of the other people whose evidence I have. A Czech teenager, Tibor Vol, who arrived in Auschwitz under, again, those horrific traumatic consequences. This entire family died, and he was the sole one who was saved because he could work. And another phenomenal source was a young chemistry student from the Jagiellonian University by the name of Mieczysław Zając, who actually worked for the dentist in the hospital, who also took care of various wards. And they got sophisticated enough to understand that there was such a polyglot population here that they organized the beds by languages. So I have here a book that deals with a unexplored topic, and that I tried as a historian then to make as accurate and as evidence supported as I could make it. So thanks very much.
Oh, thank you so much, Eva. I'm just almost speechless hearing about all that, and the
book is in the library. One of the things that reviewers from Europe have written about my book is, she must be writing for an American audience because she has to make it clear that this is a labor unit and that there are here humongous questions of economics dealing with how labor was used for the war effort and what happened to it when the Soviets arrived.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure we'll have questions for you. I know I have some questions myself, particularly at the end about, you know, in a sense, inheriting the story from your father. It's very powerful to me.
Yeah, totally accidental too.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So our final readers tonight and presenters are Gerry and Janet Suter. Mm-hmm. Gerry and Janet Suter are authors of more than 50 books, primarily histories, biographies, and fine arts. Their latest works are, the title is The Ghost Army, Conning the Third Reich, and Selling Americans on America, Journey into a Troubled Nation, as well as a historical novel, A Thread of Sand. So thank you, Gerry and Janet, for being with us, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for having us. I'll kind of start the ball rolling here with reading a little bit out of the chapter 1. And now this is a nonfiction book, but I've created a fictional construct in the beginning to kind of show what the book is actually about. And it's easier to condense that way. Before sunrise, the welcoming committee is lined up at the train station. Bucking chill winds that whistle along the street, they tug at overcoats and Sunday best hats. The high school marching band members are formed up, stamping their feet and keeping their mouthpieces dry. Blue and gold shakos are crushed down over earmuffs. Local politicians and civic leaders gather in a bunch like Arctic penguins in dark double-breasted suits. Their hands thrust into overcoat pockets, dripping crumpled speeches. A half-awake little Miss Sunshine Princess endures her mother fussing with her small rhinestone tiara. Up the street, early risers form the beginning of a line that will stretch for blocks, and virtually every one of them is looking in one direction, following the curve of the railroad tracks, past the grain silos, and across the iron bridge. Vendors have begun filing into the waiting station, filling their trays with tin badges, pennants, and boxes of pamphlets. Souvenirs of all kinds have been cut, punched, etched, and sketched for visitors waiting to board the big deal approaching down the tracks. Newspaper photographers form their own clutch. Gloved hands heft big press cameras. Fedoras are pushed back on their heads, and overcoat pockets bulge with film holders and flash bulbs. Visitors from nearby counties will join the crowd as excitement mounts. They all wait for this train, this freedom train that transports a precious cargo of yellowing paper and iconic objects, symbolic of the struggle for freedom from oppression and exhorting hard-won liberty. Also on board that train, guarded by United States Marines, is an invisible mix of definitions that encompass the word freedom, unity, consensus, conservative consumerism, opposition to foreign ideologies, and a raft of bundled subtexts. A battle of demands, alliances, compromises, and grudging acceptances has produced this reminder of greatness and purpose rolling through the troubled post-World War II America. To those on the train station platform, the Freedom Train transports the singular efforts of people just like them, who, when called upon, rose to greatness with words and deeds. It contains the thoughts of Washington, Jefferson, Franklin, Lincoln, Susan B. Anthony, Frederick Douglass, Eisenhower, Roosevelt, Truman, and 100 others. And there are the iconic objects, battle flags, liberty bonds, and calls to action that built and sustained the Republic. The agendas behind the purpose of the train are blurred by the hushed power of the displayed documents. For the men, women, and children aboarding the train, to glimpse America's turbulent past is like entering a sanctuary. It is an experience they can take home. They know that for a few moments, shuffling past the display cases, they will be in the presence of a proud history.
Okay, and that is from chapter 1 of our book, Selling Americans on America, Journey into a Troubled Nation. I'll give you a little background on that and us. First of all, Gerry worked as a teacher, feature writer, international photojournalist, and video producer for Motorola and Motivation Media. I started out as a graphic artist and then went on to be a travel agent and finally worked for the Daily Herald as a columnist, a community news coordinator, and occasionally did feature stories. In 1995, however, we formed April One Group, and originally was designed to be a video production for industries primarily. But 2 years into that, one of our clients said, "Hey, can you guys do a book on the American Fire Station?" And we said, "Sure." And it went well. And so that from there on, that led to other projects. And eventually we were doing American histories, the founding of the United States, the Vietnam War, artist biographies and presidential biographies, career series, and some town histories. Well, in 2015, we were looking around for another project. And we were always interested in the late 1940s, post-war, 1945 to 1950. I dug out a book called Columbia Chronicles of American Life, and under 1947, I found this little item, The Freedom Train, with over 100 documents, tours America. We thought, wow, we never heard of the Freedom Train. We wondered if anybody else had, or if anybody was around that still remembered it. It turned out there were no books on it. And because of that, then we began researching. We went through museum archives, read articles from newspapers at the time. There were a number of books that were out about American history at that time, and they had 1 or 2 chapters about it. But as I say, there were no books themselves on the Freedom Train. Anyway, we learned a lot about the US at that time. More than 5 million workers went on strike, 1946 to 47. GIs were coming back from Europe and Japan. They were looking for jobs and struggling to find housing. We had a president that was pretty much new to the job, and people generally had lost faith in the country. Essentially, that was the reason for the Freedom Train. A group of private citizens decided to create this traveling museum. It would carry original historic documents like the first draft of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Emancipation Proclamation, the documents that represented liberties fought for and preserved. It would remind people that freedom is everybody's job. Well, it was a huge success. The celebration, was carried through all 300 cities that the train stopped at. There were rededication weeks that were planned prior to the train's arrival. And they had pageants, they had parades. There was a Freedom Train song, there was a Freedom Train operetta, there was a Freedom Train radio show. There was even comic books. Captain Marvel featured the Freedom Train. It was the rock star of its time. So we put together an extensive proposal and a rough draft of the manuscript. We started sending it out to publishers around the country. And finally, Sartoris Literary Group in Mississippi said, yeah, I'll take it on. He helped us with the title because we'd been struggling with that for a long time. And we finally came up with Selling Americans on America, Journey into a Troubled Nation. The book came out last year, and since then we've been promoting it and having a great time doing that. We've done podcasts, radio shows, of course, Twitter and Facebook, and we're really excited about it. And do we have time to?
Yeah, well, the other thing too, I mean, this train went, like, the people who would show up, the average line would be 9,000 to 10,000 people for each city that it went to. So this was it was that much of a huge crowd. And that's what is very astonishing about it.
Do you want to talk about do we have time to plug another book real quick? If not,
A novel.
Go for it. Your time just ended, but we can take a minute to hear about your novel, definitely.
Okay, Thread of Sand. It's a romance, adventure, historic novel. Takes place in 1896 in Egypt. And all of our research is done in Egypt. And I did a lot in the British Isles in my travels, and we were able to put this all together. It's got a young lady as the hero of it, heroine, hero. And I had a wonderful time writing it, and fiction is really a lot more fun than nonfiction because you can make things up, and that's what makes it so neat.
Great, thank you so much.
thank you.
Yeah, and we already have a question for you, but I wanted to circle back because earlier on there was a question for Ray, and he was our first reader. And I am seeking the question for Ray. Hang on.
Oh, I've got it.
Awesome.
It's how many books? I believe it was how many books have you written, and if you've written any poetry. And you know what? Let me unmute you. Ray, one
for
second.
Us, for who?
For Ray, and I'll unmute all of our authors.
Yeah, this is my first book that came out in 2019. It's not the first thing that I've written, but like a lot of people, I've been writing, well, it seems like my whole life, but that is my first and only major fiction publication. I've been sending poetry out and having some of it published in local journals and so on for the last several years.
Well, the language is certainly poetic, so I can see how that would also be one of your passions.
Thank you.
Wow, absolutely.
And then,
Go ahead, Courtney.
I was gonna say, Juan David, where did you go? Oh, there you are. I'm sorry, I didn't unmute you. There was actually a follow-up question that you answered in the chat, but for anybody not following along the chat, the question was, how old were you when you began writing anything at all?
I mean, I guess writing as like a book or essays or anything outside of school, really, when I started writing the book, I mean, I started writing like most kids in school and stuff like that, but I didn't write, you know, I wasn't a 5-year-old kid like writing books or anything like that. Like I said, I mean, there was something that I wanted to do. I was inspired, and it has begun my writing career, and I just didn't think it was as enjoyable and as thought-provoking as it was. So, and now, I mean, it's really hard, it's really challenging, but it's something that is worth doing.
Great,
Excellent.
thank you.
And
Go ahead.
anyone else that has questions, please put them in the chat.
Great.
and we'll field them. So now we can get to the question for the suitors, which is, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I keep interrupting you.
So to Janet and Gerry, how do you divide your writing tasks amicably throughout all the years?
Amicably?
The
Yeah.
most important part is
Because
to have separate offices. Then we work beautifully that way.
Yeah, we edit each other's work, and sometimes I rein him in, and sometimes he has to kind of push me to use a little more colorful language. But somehow we manage.
No, it is that way. We do a lot of research, and we have to break it up because some of the things that we get into involves very complex subjects and people. But it's an amicable relationship, and we really enjoy it.
Yeah, I'm always curious about collaboration, let alone between, spouses, partners. Do you alternate chapters? Do you write a chapter? Do you kind of supplement each other in that way?
Yeah, sometimes we have alternated chapters, and we'll, as I say, we'll edit each other's work. We'll alternate as well with research because there's so much involved. So we just kind of divide the duties as, wherever our strengths are.
Awesome.
Yeah, and his every turn it is to take out the garbage and things like that. So we have to split household things among the writing chores.
Great, thank you.
I don't have any questions now, so everyone, again, feel free to throw those in there.
I can ask a question. I'm really curious, Eva, as I said, about you hearing the story from your father, if he shared it with you, if you realized it early on in life or later in life. And I guess on top of that, I would ask, I know that you're a nonfiction writer and you're doing research and you're, using kind of some linear thinking and that kind of, that gift. But I'm wondering if emotions were really overpowering at points in writing this, or if you were able to kind of compartmentalize that.
I'm a displaced person. That means to say that after the war, I grew up in Germany. And in Germany, I was surrounded by people, men and women, young people too, with the tattoos. I did not associate it with anything in particular. I didn't ask questions because it was a sensitive topic, best I could tell. I have found, both as a teacher and as a person involved in these subjects, that people who undergo a trauma as severe as concentration camps, Japanese containment camps, do not talk to anyone other than somebody else who was there. So Auschwitz, Bunamonowitz, the war, arrests, all this stuff was never a subject of conversation as I grew up. And as a matter of fact, if you look, for instance, at the age of the people who are giving testimony, like at the Skokie Holocaust Museum, it's not until you get into your 70s and 80s that the distance from the event is sufficient that you can begin speaking about it again. So everything that I have as evidence was not from a conversation. There was very, very limited conversation within the family, even as my father was aging. His one comment about Bunamonowitz was, sweetheart, it was all politics. And I had no idea what he was telling me until I got into writing about it and found the level of competition for safe jobs within Auschwitz was such that people organized and supported each other or fought each other, and it was indeed a political context. As to your question as to my emotional involvement, I couldn't afford to do that with what I was writing. This is not a memoir. This is not an emotional this, that, or the other. I'm a historian, so I have plenty of material that I've read over my life that shows me how do you act well, pretty much as a grown-up, right? You're not writing as a child. You're not writing as a someone who is responding to the events, but somehow getting control of what the events were. So emotional investment, I keep claiming there wasn't any. My husband said, "I'm kidding. You know, you have no idea." And indeed, there is some of that, but it's not stuff that I found appropriate in the book.
So
Thank you so much.
Sure.
I have another follow-up question for Eva. How long did it take you to find all of your research?
A long time. I have a very rich library now. I received the documents that I did not even know existed in 2002. I started the translation process while I was still at Lewis as a sabbatical kind of, you have to prove you're doing something during sabbatical. I was translating. So that would have been around 2004. And then I continued through a second sabbatical to flesh it out. And then the 18 months before my retirement were very, very strongly involved with the book. So the thing about this kind of research is, and I think maybe the Suters will find this as well, you find a piece of information and then there's a second piece of information out there and then you say, oh my gosh, you know, they somehow meet. And if those two meet, well, what is that relationship to that piece of information? And you've seen this name before, and where did that name come from, and just what exactly is his background? And then, you know, it just sort of blossoms and you begin creating this very intricate web to create the, you know, you're simulating something that was there. You're looking at it from a certain point of view, but it is stuff which needs to be told. I was so interested when the Suters talked about the fact no one had heard about this train, this really important event. Well, nobody has heard of this little hospital. Nobody has understood that prisoners have agency. In other words, prisoners are able to exert organizational power, protecting each other in what we usually see as a total death trap. Everybody dies. Hundreds of thousands of people actually made it through, and their story needs to be told, as well as the memorial to the many, many hundreds of thousands more that never had a chance. Never had a chance.
Thank you. Thank you. Courtney, I don't know if you have seen any other questions pop up.
Nope, not right now.
And authors, you can also feel free to ask questions of each other as well. Nikki, I'm curious to ask you, if you move between genres the way you do you do a lot of research to understand kind of audience expectations for a genre, or do you read a lot of books related to that genre, or do you just kind of jump in?
I read a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really, it depends on how I get the idea, because I'm either inspired by a book or like some random offshoot or like throwaway comment in some other thing, and that either sparks the idea or sparks me searching up more about this thing, which leads down to the rabbit hole of, hey, I want to write about that. Or it's just I have some weird dream that just like, you know what, I'm gonna write this down and see where it goes.
Mm-hmm. Right. Dreams are good fodder.
We do have another question for Eva. How long was your dad in the camp, and where were you and your mother?
Yeah, let's get a temporal clarity here. I'm a baby boomer. I was born after he left the camps. My father was arrested for disseminating anti-Nazi information from the BBC in 1941. He spent about 8 months in a jail in Krakow, and rather than being released, he was then transferred into Auschwitz. So it was from 41 until January of 45. There was the Great Evacuation. He ended up in Buchenwald, and the Americans liberated Buchenwald in April 13th of 45. My mother was a POW, not a laborer, and she was arrested during the Warsaw Uprising in the August of 44. So she was in a prison camp with officer status because she had a nursing degree. So, you know that thing about a doctor and a nurse getting together? Yeah, even then. And by August of 45, they had married. And I was checking the dates very carefully, and I was born in April of 46.
Mhm.
So there was a lot of, many, many marriages which took place. One of my very, very closest old-time friends said she knew her husband for 3 weeks, both of them coming out of camps and prisons, and they married and had a fabulous 60-year-old marriage. So sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It did not work for my parents. They were only married about 11 years.
And
No, the question from Tony, they met in the camps. No, this was after liberation. They met in a camp devoted to displaced persons who had already been liberated from the camps. And the displaced persons could have come from any number of camps in Germany, or with the great evacuation in front of the Soviets, or for that matter, people who had just lost their homes in some fashion or other. There was millions of people on the move being shoved into that. So by that time, they were in the British occupation zone, and I was born in Paderborn, Westfalen.
I have a question for all of the writers out there. Which did you find hardest, the query letter or the
First few chapters.
the first few chapters? How did it, what worked for you to get your first book published?
There speaks a man who has 50 of them published. Most of us are on a much more relaxed schedule. I don't know that there's an answer to that. You have to be able to sell your idea in a very succinct format. And most importantly, you have to send it to the person who gives a damn. So, you know, I knew a lot of publishers in the academic world, and 90% of them wouldn't touch anything having to do with Auschwitz or prisoner issues. So I went to someone who already had some kind of a track record, and that made the job way, way, way easier. I only wrote to 2 people, and the second group said, yeah. And I said, oh, sure, if you want to publish, I'll go with you. That was
You were a
Purdue,
tough act. Yeah, you were a tough act to follow.
Purdue University Press.
Yeah, I had a little trouble getting some attention to my book. I'd sent it to, well, I thought I'd try the traditional approach, and I sent the book out to, I counted them, 60 agents, and got no responses from 60 people. This is in the final draft of the book, the one that eventually got published. So after a year, and this is the problem, of course, it takes time, even with the how quickly you can get things out on the internet. It's still, I spent a year pushing the book to agents with no luck, and finally said, well, I'm done with this. I'm going to go to my list of publishers, small presses, who would look at the manuscript without it coming from an agent. And I made my first list. I said, well, here's my first dozen or so. And then I remembered a friend, a guy who I'd had heard read at one of the open mics. And I said, oh, you should check his book out. I had read his book, and I said, you know, my book is the sort of thing that they might publish. So I put that small press at the top of my list, and sent them out to those 10 people. And that was the Black Rose Writing, a small press in Texas, ended up being the one that responded and published the book. So there's just a lot of things had to come together for me for that one.
I think the hardest thing that we had with publishing our books all the way through was to take a whole 70,000 word or 80,000 word book and put it into a 5-minute elevator pitch in order to get an agent interested. Because once they get past the first 3 or 4 pages, if they're not interested in it, it goes in the slush pile. And that gets very discouraging, because sometimes you'll end up with 20, 30, 40 rejections before you finally get something. But like on our book here, it took us 2.5 years to do the book, to get all the research and everything done, and another 2 years to sell it. So you're gonna have to stick with whatever it is you're putting out there, and don't get discouraged.
I might mention to Courtney and Karen both, it's also a hard job to take your entire book and condense it into 8 minutes.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, I think that's something that is important for our authors and writers and possible writers in the future is that the world is changing. And something that you need to consider is that the world of publishing have changed radically, and how everything works is a lot different. So in the past, you would go to a publisher and they will help you sell it. Now, publishers look for people who already have an audience, so they can almost sell the book themselves without needing a publisher. That's how kind of works now. So are publishing companies important? Sure they are. Are agents important? Sure they are. But if you have an audience that trusts you and is a fan of your work, you have a much easier and simply a better time when it comes to publishing your books and getting it out there to your audience. And the way to do that is a lot more. You could get a little strategic about it, but there are ways like a newsletter or a bunch of different things. But I think focusing on that publishers and those people are not as important, and they usually come to you when you have what I'm telling you, the audience. That you it's like when you can sell your book by yourself, that's when the book's publisher would come to you, which they're no longer necessary. On that note, I did use a publisher because I'm not at that point yet, but
That's
something
very
to
true.
consider.
Yeah.
Yes, it is. It's a lot of our books were contract books where we sold our first 2 or 3 books, and then we had publishers coming to us with ideas along the lines of the books we sold. And then if that kind of built up over a period of time, and that's how we were able to make as many as we did. But the idea of a publisher used to actually give you a hand. They had a marketing wing in the publishing house, but then that's kind of disappeared now. And you have to pretty much do it yourself now. At the agents, remember, they only make money when you make money. They only get 10 to 15% of whatever you get. If you sell a book for 99 cents, an ebook, you have to sell a lot of ebooks in order for a publisher to make any, agent to make any kind of money off of it.
Yeah.
So it is a business just like anything else, and we found that out for sure.
We're still learning.
Oh yeah, we're still.
And we knew it, was changing, but it is different, and you're right.
Yes.
Yeah, just one comment about this other side of the academic publishing that I got involved in, and that is that invaluable to the process once they agree to take the book is that I got responses from readers who read the manuscript and said, Bacon, how about so-and-so? Hey, Bacon, have you read X or Y or Z? And, oh, that's a good part. And, whoa, this is boring. So it is almost like an editorial function, which is more or less disappeared entirely from what I can tell from general publishing in fiction. So that was invaluable. But then there's also the technical help. I mean, have you ever written an index? Maybe the Suters have written indexes, but it's a complex task. And Purdue University was able to put me in contact with a professional indexer, who, of course, what she has is the professional software to do indexing. But it was critical for a reader of my kind of book to be able to go into an index and follow a story by way of the index. So it's a very, very different kind of beast. But one of the things that the university presses do not have any way of actually selling, other than with a sort of a generic ad here or there or at conferences. So insofar as I sell books, I've given an unbelievable number of talks to business people about the big business in the camps, to nurses about issues with healthcare, and to students, of course, as well. And in another, I don't know, 30 or 40 years, I'm sure I will have sold a number of books.
And I'm
Thank
sure with
you.
self-publishing too, Nikki, that comes up in terms of sales.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I can't thank you all enough for being here. Wonderful variety of authors with us tonight, and so generous in sharing your work and your perspectives and your time. And to our audience, thank you so much as well for being here. I think the more we can work to support local authors and readers of local authors, I just think that kind of interconnectedness will make our world a much more hopeful and community-based place. So thank you. And Courtney will be sending out an email with information where you can access the author's books for purchase, and also the survey. And I will include, send to Courtney, information about Inky in case there are people out there who are interested in self-publishing. So
Thank you. Good night.
that's for that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Karen and Courtney.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yep, thanks for having us.